Yes, please. Thank you so
Okay,
much.
thank you. Thank you. No, thank you for your patience. Look, so I was saying that if we were to develop our technology at an evolutionary pace, uh, then the fish would know how to avoid our fishing trawlers. We would not overfish. But the problem is the fish can learn on an evolutionary pace and cannot keep pace with our technological changes. So they end up being hunted in much larger numbers. But our flourishing, we eat better, we have more choices because we are killing more and we are more in numbers and we can sustain these numbers. So so these kind of and but it also produces problems for a personal level. I was going to end by talking about how the planetary comes into our everyday life. So how the big scale comes into small scale. So the two slides I was going to show you was really this huge earth moving machinery are now available, at least in the West, I'm sure in India too, as children's developmental playthings. So, I see a child going around a huge earth moving machine, and next moment I see him playing in a sand pit with toy versions. And in my head, I call them Anthropocene toys. These are children growing up thinking the Anthropocene to be normal and to have been eternal. But the example I was going to give you are some studies that have been done, sort of broadly ethnological studies, but not by ethnologists, but journalists and some economists, of the story of air conditioning purchase in Delhi. So, Delhi now has 5 or 6 days, 5 or 6 or 7 very, very hot days in summer. And the calculations show that Delhi is going to have about 75 such days towards the end of the century. So Delhi is going to, all the Indian cities are becoming heat islands. Uh, and some New York journalists and my economist colleague, Michael Greenstone, who runs an energy policy center, both here and in our center in Delhi, they've been doing surveys in Delhi. And the most interesting thing about air conditioned sales, not just in Delhi, but in Indian cities, these sales have been booming, air conditioned sales. That they are actually booming because of people who are buying an air conditioner for the first time in their life. So this is not the second unit or the third unit purchase, it's the first unit purchase that's pushing the sales envelope. And so these are mostly not so well-to-do people. But when they ask them about what it means to buy air conditioners, they say that, somebody would say, it's the first time that my children could sit down whole night and prepare for their medical school exam or whatever without getting completely uh, eaten up by mosquitoes. Or 7 or 8 people who sleep in a room or a family, they say it's for the first time that we had a good night's sleep. So air conditioners are directly contributing to human welfare, no question, right? But Indian air conditioners are cheap and can be produced in a lane garage, or can be assembled together. You'll often call a local guy and say, come and repair my air conditioner, right? And they come and repair it. That's because the technology is old and the chemicals used are far more harmful for the atmosphere than even methane is. But at the same time, it's been proven in studies in Texas and other places that air conditioning actually saves lives. Extreme heat kill people. So, so they're actually benefiting from the air conditioners. But the air is suffering. And when in 2016, all these different nations met in Kigali, in Rwanda, to talk about what to do with air conditioners, India bargained hard to be among the slowest countries to change to the more modern air conditioners, because the modern air conditioners are more expensive. They need more trained labor. Your local garage mechanic won't be able to do it, to install them. And the demand was popular because people needed them. And it's also possible, I don't know. The government may have been under pressure from air conditioning manufacturing lobbies in India. I don't know. Possible. But India bargained hard to be among the slowest. And what that means is that people are making trade-offs between their own human time-based calculation, that if my son or daughter gets into a medical school, they have a brighter future. If Delhi gets unlivable, they can use their skills and migrate somewhere else. Maybe they will go and live in Chicago somewhere. right? So this upwardly mobile, Arjun has a beautiful piece on the right to aspire, written during the heyday of globalization, not global warming. So in if you bring back the planetary into the human life, then you see humans make decisions based on their sense of life, intergenerational care, all of those things. It doesn't always sync with what the planet demands. And the problem with bringing it, some people say, we have to have useful science, we have to have science that humans can use. The problem is that people forget that most of this planet is water, that's seas. Land is one third. And there are many parts of this planet which are uninhabited by humans, but that play a critical role in the climate story. So the deep oceans play a critical role in absorption of heat. The Siberian sort of permafrost has a role to play. These are not inhabited places now, right? So here is a science that goes beyond what humans can experience. It goes on a much larger planetary scale. Humans have an innate capacity to scale, or what anthropologists call to interscale, that is to convert one scale into another. But it's not, it's fungible, but it's not infinitely fungible. So you have this, so you have this interesting story, going back to what Francis was saying, the individual human exists, their concerns exist, their cares exist, and it's with those cares, they do things. I mean, I was discussing the Delhi situation with a colleague in Delhi who works on climate change and is an advisor to the Indian government sometimes. And he said, Dipesh, but the government needs to change building codes. They need to help with public transport. They need to do things that so that it doesn't devolve all on the individual human. Now, sure, but when the government is not doing, the individual human still has to make decisions. And so what I want to say is that as a historian, this whole crisis made me much more aware of how multi-scalar our historical and social imaginations have become as a result of this. And becoming multi-scalar doesn't solve all the problems, but unless you think on multi-scale at the same time, multiple scales at the same time, you don't understand both the nature of the problem and the predicament that humans are suffering, right? And I'll just end by saying this. We are becoming an urban civilization, urban-based. By the end of the century, human species will be basically an urban species. And the more we live in these big cities, the less flexible we are in terms of our choices. You can't, see, if you live in a village, you can evacuate the village. But if you live in a city of 20 million, government can't say, look, evacuate tomorrow. So what that means is that urban-based, technology-based civilization will definitely make more and more technological gambles. Because that is, in a sense, the easiest option, because we don't have to change things. So there are dreams like if you change to renewables, all the other luxuries can carry on, right? You just go to renewable. Yeah. If you think about climate change, simply about energy problem. Talk about smart cities. You don't give up anything, just cities become smarter, right? So it's, but I think this tendency to gamble on technology is built into the kind of civilization we have, which has allowed for our flourishing. And you see that in the Paris climate deal. The Paris climate deal assumes that by 2070 or something, we will have technology whereby we'll produce negative emissions, which means not zero, which means we will not be producing any carbon and we'll be withdrawing from the atmosphere whatever carbon has been produced, excess carbon. We don't have that technology for scrubbing the air and sequestering the carbon somewhere. We may not. But the Paris deal was made possible because we gambled on a piece of technology, which don't have, right? Because everybody is trying to bargain with the planet for more time for growth, for vikas, sabka saath, sabka vikas, all these promises, because whoever is the Prime Minister of India, doesn't matter whether it's from the Congress or BJP, they will have to listen to these small voices of history who want to buy an air conditioner so that their children can do better at exams, so that they have a good night's sleep. So this question of synchronizing the human scale of time, the scale of time of institutions, with these huge scales that have been kind of revealed by the planetary crisis, this will become a major challenge to the way we think about the globe, the planet, and to our very sense of the political in the years to come. Okay, thank you very much for your patience, and particularly for the time that I dropped out. Thank you.
Wow, Professor Chakrabarty, I mean, it's such an expansive lecture, and I honestly, I mean, one really felt that you should not stop at all, because we wanted to keep on hearing.
No, it's
And
been a long.
I could not hear you, but
No, I
yeah.
said it's been long for you. I mean, it's a long day, long conference, but
No,
thank you for your patience.
but that's exactly what I was saying, that even though this is the third day of the conference and this is the last session of the conference, and we are having fairly long days, but I think one is just so invigorated by almost some sort of a manifesto that you've given to us about what we need to do, not just in humanities, but probably in all disciplines in some ways, that one really did not want you to stop, Professor
Thank you.
Chakrabarty. I mean, I don't really know how to thank you for this extremely expansive lecture, but I think just some of the things that that kind of strike me, and I'm sure there'll be questions which will be there, so I don't really want to hog too much of the time, but I think the very critical distinction that you make between how we have thought of globalization, because even when we were writing the CFP, I mean, we are informed by our reading formation in some ways.
Sure.
From globalization to global warming, and how the notion of the global itself needs to change to a planetary, decentered notion of the very anthropocentric and human-centric kind of ways in which we've thought all our categories, I mean, in all our disciplines. And you were absolutely right, which is that, how the blind spots that we have in humanities, in literature, and you were so generous in being self-reflexive, even about the kind of engagement that even the biggest of scholars of our times have had at the time when the scientists had started to already talk about global warming and global change, and we were still kind of, but these are really issues that we will still need to grapple with, in terms of how do we look at our own academic engagements, in terms of there being the question of Dalit identity still knocking at the door, and yet there being the concern for the planet in some ways, which has to obviously be as immediate as our immediate contextual realities. And I think one needs to really think about time and history and literature and our responses in so many different ways. And I really liked the point that you made, and it rang, with the idea of what Paul Virilio also talks about in his book, Speed and Politics, about accelerationism. And I think the idea of acceleration is so central. And I think, and especially, I mean, and not just simply to critique the idea of global capitalism, but also to talk about politics and ethics, and probably also to possibly develop some sort of an idea of an aesthetics of our own times in some senses. And, I mean, I'm so glad that your lecture actually came in a series. I mean, and this is something that we had thought in our heads when we were planning your talk after Radhika Subramanian's, letter from a rat.
I'm sorry, I missed Radhika's, yeah.
And Francesca Ferrando's, intervention into, of course, post-humanist thought. But really, what you, and also about the technosphere, and, and how that impacts us. But I think what the manifesto, I think what we need to really think about, and I think, Professor Dipesh Chakrabarty, we will have to listen to this lecture many times, and also reflect on how, therefore, this will impact our disciplines and our disciplinary concerns, and from whichever locations we may speak from, whether it's from art or history, or to think about time, or about human, but I think what you've suggested is the manifesto, which is that one has to necessarily be multi-scalar. And I think that, for me, is a very huge takeaway, with which I think all of us, whichever discipline we come from, will have to start thinking from. So, and also, I think your cautions and your warnings about, the urban spheres that we are going to become, and the impact that it will have, while we are very happy to write about Maximum City and all kinds of novels about the cities, but I think one has to probably become a little self-critical also about our own engagements in some senses. So I mean, I can't really think of responses, Professor Dipesh Chakrabarty. It was an absolutely fantastic. I mean, this is what one was expecting from a valedictory, and you really turned our CFP on its head, as we were hoping that you would, and asking us to think again about the categories with which we've been working, and probably evolve new categories from what I would call your February 2021 manifesto of a multi-scalar thinking that we need to probably launch into. And so I'm really grateful to you, Professor Dipesh Chakrabarty.
That's very kind.
And though we've really taken a lot of your time, and you know, Professor Chakrabarty, you've been so indulgent with us right from the first day when we got in touch with you till now. You've not really, you know, you've not really been economical with the time that you've given to
No,
us,
no,
and you've
that's
been
fine.
so generous
I'm
and so
happy.
indulgent, and we're really grateful to you for
It's
that.
my pleasure and privilege.
No,
It's my
and
pleasure and privilege.
and so, Professor Dipesh Chakrabarty, in that same spirit, I would ask for a little bit more of your indulgence, though
Sure.
we have passed the time. But I think, I mean,
Sure.
I had earlier thought that I would ask, you know, my colleagues, but I think I've hogged so much of the time. Professor Isabel Karaman and Professor Zino Ackerman and Professor Nishad Zaidi, who are part of my team on this project, and also my superstars, Shraddha and Zahra, to probably also have some sort of a response. But I'm not, but I think I can sacrifice my own people. So we will come at the end if there is any response from them. But maybe if there are some, and I'm pretty sure, you know, that there'll be hundreds and hundreds of questions. So yeah, so if you can take some questions and respond. And
sure, I'd love to. I'd love to. I have no problem.
Read 2 or 3 questions together, and then you can take. And then when you get really tired, then you can tell us. And then
do the questions show up on the chat folder? Do they show up?
Zahra will read the questions for you.
Okay. Yeah. Let me just, okay, sure. Go ahead, and then I'll make some notes.
Thank you so much, Professor Chakrabarty. Going by the chat box, which is alive and buzzing even now, we have a lot of questions, but I will do my best to take as many of them as possible. Let's do 2-3 questions at one go. They're all pretty huge questions, so please stop me anytime you want.
That's right.
Dr. Gautam Chakrabarty says, thanks again, Professor Chakrabarty, for this scintillating talk and warm and snowy greetings from Berlin. I was wondering if your point of the planet decentering human beings could point towards a broader post-human turn in the environmental humanities generally, and the cultural politics of globality, planetarity specifically. In other words, should we, theoretically speaking, think of a post or trans-Anthropocene historiography? Next, we have a question from Professor Nishat Heather. I'm going to truncate it a bit if that's okay. So she talks about the contemporary wave of populism and populist governments. And her question to you is that, is there undoubtedly a populist backlash against globalization, but what kind of globalization? Analogous to multiple modernities, we see many contenders of globalization, such as capitalist and neoliberal, and other globalizations, such as justice globalism or jihadist globalism. So is it impossible to talk about a single monolithic globalized world? Do I stop or can I continue?
No, maybe just quickly, I'll respond to these quickly. So thank you both for your questions. The planet, a trans-Anthropocene history. Yes, I mean, see, one of the things that this is responding to both questions, one of the things that happens in the humanities, and partly because, you know, we are not under pressure often to define things, and I think definition is often quite limiting for how we want to think, is that words inevitably take on many meanings and get pluralized. So the word globe, there are obviously many globes, and some people have already critiqued my use of the word planet by saying there are many planets, because there are many understandings of what the planet is. And I think all of that is legitimate. The only thing I would say is that the moment you pluralize, you bring it actually into the human world. You make humans central, because you're actually talking about humans' plural understanding. So the planet I was thinking about, I'm going back to Bruce talked about this question. The planet I was thinking about is, you may pluralize it, but you can't, if you pluralize it by referring back to the very different ways in which people in different cultures have thought about the planet. Like how have our Jyotishas thought about planet? You make human history central again, whereas I was trying to find a kind of an Archimedean point from which I could think that humans had been decentered. So this critique has been made of me recently by this French scholar, Christophe Bonnery, who has actually written an essay that's come out in German from Hamburg in a book on social theory in the Anthropocene. But this is critiquing me, saying that, Dipesh, you're thinking of planet as only one thing from Earth system science, but humans have actually thought about the planet in many different ways. And Earth system science is only one way of thinking about it. I don't disagree with it. All I'm saying is that the critique has to give up on the search for an Archimedean point from which to decenter the human. So I was trying to use the planet in my work more as a category that Meyasu would approve of, kind of an archy object that is not dependent on human recognition of it. It's kind of something that goes beyond a Kantian kind of exchange between our faculty for recognizing an object and the existence of the object. But I basically agree that to the question about globalism, if I understand it, I mean, there are clearly multiple meanings of modernity. There are clearly multiple ways of being globalized. I mean, I often say jokingly to my friends that, you know, the people of the developed countries don't have to leave their countries in order to get globalized. But a lot of Indians or Africans can sort of get globalized by leaving their places, at least in terms of travel. For whatever reasons, you will find that we travel more to these countries and they come to live in our countries. But the populism question is actually very important, and I feel it's part of the crisis we are facing. And the crisis is that it's simple. What we talk about India as jobless growth, which is a world phenomenon, and the role that technology is playing is in effect making a distinction between the distinction that I make between work and labor. And basically, capitalism has discovered that technology can do a lot of the work that laborers used to do, which required toil on behalf of, you know, initially animals, then human beings. And so the application of AI, artificial intelligence, to many domains of work is actually producing a very restless, particularly in a place like India, which is where the population is so young, a restless youth that can't find proper forms of employment, and where there is nothing like, you know, many economists are now talking about the need for a universal basic income. If you're going to move to a world where there's not enough labor for human beings, not enough employment, then we need to think about what to do. But in its absence, I often feel that populist politics are soaking up the energies of a restless youth, for engaging their attention for completely regressive causes like racism, like xenophobia, like targeting minorities. And, you know, we are seeing this in many countries, not excluding India. So all this is, but population is a very interesting question in terms of climate change. Going forward, population is going to matter because the argument in India and China is an anti-poverty argument that we have to pull out millions out of poverty. And that's why we need plentiful and cheap energy. And even now, fossil fuels present one of those cheapest sources for all kinds of reasons. There are critiques of that position, but that's what the position is. And so the population, on the one hand, bringing people out of poverty is important, welfare is important, numbers are also important. So this is something that humans will have to collectively ponder. And I go back to what Francesca was saying, that while we are divided, while there's inequality, there is a question of commonness in it. There is a question of being each other, even in a differentiated way, being with each other. And, you know, when the climate thing is bargained or put under bargaining with IPCC, when governments come, the expression common but differentiated responsibility is an expression they deal with. And in that expression, differentiated responsibility is clearly understood. It means the historical responsibility of industrialized nations and the less responsibility on the part of the industrializing nations. But the expression common is not very well understood. My knowledge is that the expression common was put in there in that sentence, in that phrase, to keep the Americans happy, because the Americans wouldn't sign off on a document that just spoke about differentiated responsibility. But I think it's time, even if the common was an empty word there, it's time to give it meaning. And in that sense, I share Francesca's spirit that it's not a matter of denying the inequalities. We have to fight the inequalities and the injustices, and at the same time think about what is common. And, you know, my great example of this is actually Rohit Vemula's suicide note. And in Rohit Vemula's suicide note, he said, you can think of human beings either as a mind that is kind of a mind independent of the social marks of the body, or he said, as glorious stardust. And because he was an avid reader of Carl Sagan, he knew that very ancient atomic particles in the universe actually circulate through our bodies. So when he said stardust, he was not referring to the film fair, to the film magazine. He was clearly referring to the ancient particles going through our bodies. And what I read in that suicide note is both an acknowledgement of the horrible inequalities of which against which his death was a protest, but also a cosmic aspiration. And that cosmic aspiration was his way to emphasize a certain commonness in our physical creaturely life. And I think that is also part of the project, in making history, imagination multiscalar. How do we think of ourselves together, and how do we think of all those differences that are as critically important as our togetherness is?
Thank you so much, Professor Chakrabarty. If you're okay with the time, I
Sure.
can take some more questions. Okay.
Sure.
So the next one is from Abhishek Pandit. And he says, even in the planetary approach to the process of sense making, do certain hierarchies exist whereby some life forms are at a much privileged position than others? And could it be that great environmental balance we perceive to exist is a product of human-centric knowledge system? He's referring to your talk and Susan Friedman's book that planetary may be more amicable than global. He also wonders whether there's a different sense of the planet when we think of a slogan like Save the Planet in America, but also from the view of, he says, a third world country, and he asks you to pardon the old term, when we think of the planetary modernity. Let me just add another question to this. Frida Masuma wonders, what are your thoughts on the future of literature in the context of such global ecological issues? May I take some more, or do we stop here?
Yeah,
for this?
I can answer these two quickly, and
Okay.
then
Yeah.
I need sort of more memory cells to add to my brain. So when the questioner said some life forms are privileged, I assume that Abhishek meant humans. Is that what you meant, Abhishek? No, anyway, I have no way of finding out. Anyway, but yes, humans have been very privileged. And, see, the bulk of life on this planet, both by numbers and by weight, I understand, the bulk of life is microbial. It's bacteria, it's viruses, it's fungi, and all of these very, very small things that you can't even see. And humans are a very minority form of life. So we come late, we're a minority form of life, but we dominate the order of life. So we are causing extinctions of species, we are causing a crisis in biodiversity. And in that sense, I think of humans as a minority that acts as though it were the majority, right? And it sort of reminds me of the white people in South Africa during the apartheid days. And therefore, I think there's a need, and this actually goes to the second question as well, there's a need to develop minoritarian thinking. How to actually think like minorities do. The other day I was discussing this problem with my friend, very good friend, Homi Baba, and I said to Homi, I'm not a Parsi. If you grow up in India as a Parsi, you probably have a sense of minority thinking. If you grow up in independent India as a Muslim, you probably have a sense of what it means to be in a minority. I was born to a majority with its kind of softer and harder versions of majoritarianism. And the softer version just came automatically because it was part of one's, thinking of one's goodness or whatever. And but I think we need to learn from people who have had to think out of minority positions. Hannah Arendt has some wonderful things to say about this in her essays on Jewishness. Very interesting things against Jewish majoritarianism. But but looking at characters. So there's a lot to say about that. The reason why I say that this has something to do with the literature, but not all, but is that I think because one of the persons I'm thinking about is Kafka, and Deleuze's treatment of Kafka in talking about minor literature, minoritarian thinking. And Amitav Ghosh has written a fair amount on what the climate crisis means for literature. Kim Stanley Robinson's books are getting a lot of attention and fascinating stuff on climate, what's now called cli-fi, or climate fiction. So I think literature has a lot to do, and our ethical thinking, if it has to be informed by minoritarian thinking, I think literature, poetry, these things have a big role to play. So, but in order to play the role, you'll have to also engage with this question of the minority status of the human. Okay.
Thank you so much. Before I continue, I would just like to ask the chair if we still have time.
Professor Chakrabarty, do we stop?
I have time. I have time. So if people have questions, I'm happy to answer.
You've just been too kind, Professor Chakrabarty.
No.
Thank you so much. Zahra,
So,
maybe a couple of more, and then
yeah, let's just take a couple of more. This one is from Soma Basu, and the question is: from spectacles to virtual augmented reality in becoming the omnipresent, omniscient, do you think humans are striving to escape the spatiality of globe/planet? Do you find a desire in the cyborgian being to escape centrality? The next question is from Faizan Mukim. What would you say on Peter Ward's media hypothesis, life as ultimately self-destructive, as opposed to Lovelock's Gaia hypothesis?
So actually, I don't know the Peter Ward's hypothesis, so I can't respond to it. So that's an easy answer, but I will read up and find more. So thank you for mentioning it. But if you wouldn't mind telling me what the hypothesis was in a few sentences, I'd love to learn about it. So can you go back to Shoma Basu's question and repeat it, please? I think I missed parts of it.
Let me just repeat it. From spectacles to virtual/augmented reality in becoming the omnipresent, omniscient, do you think humans are striving to escape the spatiality of globe/planet? Do you find a desire in the cyborgian being to escape centrality?
This is again a rich question. I don't think I can do full justice to it, but of course, when you think about humans trying to do this with the digital technology, you also have to keep in mind the digital divide that also exists in the world, right? I mean, I know that from a Calcutta colleague who teaches in a college, undergraduate college, that her teaching, I had assumed that everybody is using Zoom, and then until she told me that she was teaching on the phone through text messages. And that's a very different experience of space and time, text messages, from what we're experiencing, even including the crash that we suffered. So does it escape us from the globe-planet distinction to another kind of space? I mean, I tend to think of this space as very global. I'll tell you what, I mean, I made this point, but it's a difficult point to make, but I'll make it again. And it might take several tellings and several arguments, actually, for me to communicate it properly, even if you were to disagree at the very end, which is that, see, my reading of Planet and the Globe, the distinction, was very deeply inspired. It's not a copy, but it was very deeply inspired by an essay that Heidegger wrote on Plato's allegory of the cave, right? So, and the cave story, where these humans who first come out into the light, their eyes get dazzled, they're out of the cave, and finally, when they get their vision back, what they see are forms. So they see a tree, they see the form of a tree. They see a fish, they see the form of a fish. And what allows them to see the form is light itself, which itself doesn't have a form. So Heidegger's argument is that there is an informal condition for formality. Like there is something that is non-formal that actually creates the condition for seeing forms. And this is why, and when I think about politics, see, when we are able to, when we say India is more democratic than China, or the United States today is less democratic than it used to be, if we make statements of that, more or less, we are making implicitly formal statements. I mean, in other words, we must carry some notion or some scale, some algorithm by which we say this is more, this is less. And you see it very clearly that justice has a form, politics is formal. In the work of John Rawls, for instance, a theory of justice is an extremely formal structure, right? He's able to almost create an algorithm for justice, right? But so for me, the planet is the informal condition of forms. The planet has no form. There's no ideal form. The planet could have been without life. As multicellular creatures, we have an investment in biodiversity because we are part of biodiversity. Without biodiversity, we don't exist. So that kind of is a self-interested investment. It's out of enlightened self-interest that we should be interested in biodiversity. But purely from the planet's point of view, if the planet returned to being a rocky planet, would the planet be sorry? No, because the planet is not being observed by somebody. The planet doesn't have a community of planets in which there will be an ideal form for the planet. So the planet in that sense is not amenable to formal thinking, but the globe is, because the globe immediately raises questions of power, inequality. That's why democracy, rights, all of these things in my head are formal questions. In other words, they are questions that can be seen to have formal aspects. And in that sense, that's what I mean when I said that the globe is constitutionally political and allows for politics. The planet resists politicization, but when the planet is furious, we relate to it as a creature trying to survive on the planet. And that's why it reduces us, because again, as Kant said, that our highest form of politics is the highest form of morality, right? The politics is also an attempt to create a moral community. And to create a moral community is to engage in experiment with forms of democracy, forms of rule. So the planet is, in my head, the non-formal condition for the human capacity to see forms. And politics for me belongs to the domain of the formal, that which has forms.
Thank you so much, Professor Chakrabarty. We still have a lot of questions, but we'll make sure to send all the questions to Professor over email. I think that's the best we can do right now. We've taken so much of your time, so I won't speak anymore.
No, thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. I'll hand over the mic to our rapporteurs, Sakshi and Sango, and they can handle the rest.
Thank you so much, Professor Dipesh Chakrabarty, for that detailed analysis of human society and life at large. You pack so much in 60 minutes that I'm sure I speak on behalf of everyone here when I say that these ideas are going to influence us and make us think for a long time to come. If I could now request Shraddha to take over and deliver the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Sakshi. Thank you, Professor Chakrabarty. It was an honor to hear you speak. Honorable guests, conference speakers, professors, friends, and students, it is my honor and a privilege to have been asked to propose a vote of thanks at the valedictory session of our conference. I, on behalf of the conference team and my own behalf, extend a very hearty vote of thanks to the Vice Chancellor, Professor Najma Akhtar, for her encouragement and support towards our conference. I thank the 4 PIs of the conference, Professor Simi Malhotra, Professor Zino Ackerman, Professor Nishad Zaidi, and Professor Isabel Karaman for the exciting project that resulted in this conference. Our PIs vested their faith in us, and Simi ma'am led from the front, guiding us and encouraging us throughout the planning of this event. Professor Rapporteurs, Professor Chakrabarty, Professor Moylan, and Professor Levitt inspired conversations that have enlightened new research projects in all of us who were fortunate enough to hear them speak. Our plenary speakers, Professor Bradley, Dr. Manoj N.Y., Professor Ananya Kabir, Monsieur Ari Gauthier, Professor David Shalkwick, Professor Miriam Walraven, Dr. Abhishek Parui, Dr. Gairola, Professor Brandon Labelle, Professor Yasmin Arif, Professor Suman Gupta, Professor Radhika Subramaniam, and Professor Francesca Ferrando. We have been touched by your passion towards your work, and we thank you for sharing your thoughts with us. All of you have truly inspired us. I would also like to thank our chairs, Professor Nishad Zaidi, Professor Soumyabrata Chaudhary, Dr. Manoj NY, Professor Dilip Menon, Professor Angie Multani, Professor Ackerman, Professor Shoikat Majumdar, Professor Karaman, Dr. Parui, Professor Stuti Khanna, Professor Brinda Bose, Professor Asaduddin, Professor Bhaduri, and Professor Simi Malhotra, with immense gratitude for giving us their time and consideration. An event like this cannot happen overnight. The wheels start rolling weeks ago. For us, it was months ago. It requires planning and a bird's eye for all sorts of details. We have been fortunate enough to be backed by a team of very motivated and dedicated colleagues who know their job and are result-oriented. I would like to express my deep sense of gratitude to our moderators and rapporteurs, Stephen, Grace, Sakshi, Jubi, Anup, Susan, Indrani, Ruchi, Kashish, Tanya, Suman, Kalyani, Aditi, Mobita, Sadaf, and Sango. 3 cheers to all of you. In the same spirit, I would like to sincerely thank our dedicated administrative staff, Irfanji and Ashokji, for their consistent efforts and for being the pillars on which the success of the entire event rests. I would also like to take this opportunity to place on record our hearty thanks to the CIT staff for the logistic support they have extended all through, and to MHRD Spark for the funding, without which the event wouldn't have been possible. I would like to congratulate Miss Zahra Rizvi, the tireless and ever-smiling constant partner of mine in the planning of this event. The conference owes its success to you, Zahra. And finally, I would like to thank all of you for being with us today. It has been a pleasure. Thank you so very much. Thank you so much.
And thank you to Shraddha, who's literally the soul of this conference. Without you, nothing would have been possible. We all know that. So thank you so much. And we're so glad you stayed for so long with all of us. Special thanks to Professor Chakrabarty, who's still here.
Thank you.
Thank you
Yeah,
so much.
thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you very
Professor
much.
Dipesh
Thank you,
Chakrabarty.
Professor
Thank you.
Chakrabarty.
Yeah. And I must also acknowledge that the real superstars of this conference are Zahra and Shraddha. They've been doing all the hard work with me.
Absolutely,
So we're
absolutely.
really grateful to them.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Professor Dipesh Chakrabarty, for
Thank
your
you.
indulgence.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
thank you. So I'll leave now then. Thank you very much.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. That was really
Thank you to everybody who joined.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
And I must mention Stephen, who handles our YouTube channel. So, yes.
Zahra, maybe you can stop the